Welcome everyone. Welcome to another stream. Today we are going to be looking at a video about line technique from David Finch. I'm going to be watching another video about line technique, and I'm going to be seeing what I can learn, the tips I can pick, the notes I can take, and how I can improve, or the things that I need to work on, like when doing line art for comics. So let's just get into it and let's just see how it goes.
About shape language. If you're familiar with the concept of shape language, it's very likely that you're thinking about something to do with painting. As I understand it, in painting, shape language is all about using brushstrokes to describe form. And true masters at shape language can create paintings that are beautiful not only in their subject matter, composition, and use of lighting, but also in the visible technique in the way that the paint was laid down. But in this video, we're going to talk about how we can use shape language to bring our line art to the next level. So to start with, I've gone ahead and drawn two figure examples. The first one uses nothing but simple curves, but in this video we're going to talk about how
he has drawn some figures, so I'm going to have to draw those figures to catch up with what he's talking about.
We can use shape language to bring our line art to the next level. So to start with, I've gone ahead.
Alright, let's see. He has two figures over here, and I think he's doing them to sort of illustrate what's up. I'll just let it run for a while and let's see what he's talking about before I actually take action.
Drawn two figure examples. The first one uses nothing but simple curves, and the second one uses nothing but straight lines. In the first example, you can see you end up with something that, while anatomically correct enough, it looks very soft and really doesn't have a lot of believability. I'm sure you've seen a lot of examples of anatomy drawn this way, and it's possible this is something you might have run into in your own work and not known why it ends up looking the way that it does. In the second example, I've used nothing but straight lines, and you can see that I end up with something that looks very, very rigid. It actually looks somewhat better than the first example, I think, but it's also a very, very limited approach. And the second example is why I think that telling people to use a lot of hard edges and to not use curves is maybe a little bit of a mistake, and it doesn't really tell the whole picture. I've actually given that advice myself, and I've really learned that it's a little bit more complex than that. I've got a third figure lightly sketched in, but before we get there, I want to give you a quick overview of the kind of shapes that we're trying to achieve. So first I've drawn a simple curve, and you can see that it looks fine, but it really doesn't have any character to it at all. In order to take that curve to the next step, we're going to use something called a line of beauty. This is something that I've talked about quite a bit before, but I really want to go in depth into how we actually use it in practice all over a drawing. Now I'm just going to go ahead and show you the way that I tend to use a line of beauty a little bit more commonly. So I'm drawing a simple curve, and then going into a hard transition into an opposing curve, and then another hard transition back into the original curve. It's really just a variation on a softer line of beauty, but it's something that I think can give your work a little bit more edge. Unfortunately, I don't really think that drawing simple lines like this on a piece of paper is an effective way to get this concept across. So we're going to go back to our third figure drawing. We're going to take this basic shape, and we're going to use it all over the...
The way I understand this, he says it's line of beauty, but the way I personally understand it is using thick to thin lines, having good line width whenever you're looking at a drawing. If you look at an ink, what actually makes that inked work that you're working on aesthetically pleasing is if you're drawing a circle, for instance, the fact that some parts of the circle have thick sides and some parts have thin sides or thin lines is what makes that circle a lot more aesthetically pleasing in comparison to something that is just monotone, something that doesn't have any sort of character to it. Because once you do something like this, it actually tells the viewer instinctively that it adds shadows to the stuff. Because ideally, whenever you're using lines to draw, that is not how things look in real life. Lines are just what helps us to represent it, of course, unless you're actually doing something a lot more detailed. But usually lines, really, we don't have lines around us whenever we look at our hands or our bodies. What we usually have is values. We have light and dark, there's an interaction, there's contrast, right? That actually creates visual impact whenever we are looking at an image. So what can help us get closer to that is if we're using what he said, line of beauty, or too thick to thin lines whenever we are drawing, because is what's going to make it look pretty and give it some depth, give the image that you're drawing some depth.
Start with my bicep. I'm creating a curve going outward, and then
you know what, I'm actually have to go back and draw this stuff that he drew over here, so that I just have to sketch it so that I can see and just follow his technique. So you have to be patient with me. Have to be patient with me. Let me just quickly sketch this out. One way is because usually whenever you're drawing head like in these types of angles, like either side view or just a little bit of 3/4 view, one mistake I always made is that I would just like divide it into like two, the parts of the head into two, and that will be all. But actually there's another division that has to occur, because this is like the first part of the mask, and actually there's a second part of the mask which is like this. But if you just divide it like just between like just 1 and 2, it's going to be difficult, because there should be 1, 2 and 3, which will allow enough space for the rest of the skull and enough space for your like the parts of the face that needs to be added, and things won't look like out of place or not so proportional.
We're going to go back to our third figure drawing. We're going to take this basic shape and we're going to use it all over the figure to give us something that has much more pleasing shape language. And so I'm going to go ahead and start with my bicep. I'm creating a curve going outward and then opposing the curve for the long curve of the bicep, and then creating an opposing curve.
One thing I like with his pencil is that he can look at how thick he can like go, and that's like a problem I kind of have with mine sometimes. Anyways, we'll still work with it. You know what, because this is actually the penciling stage, it's not the inking. But I'll still make it look good. Let's see.
Again, going the other way. For the tricep, I'm going to do essentially the same thing. An inward curve connecting to an outward curve, and then connecting to another inward curve as we go down. And it really is just using opposing curves over and over again, really over the course of the entire drawing. Going into our deltoid, the same thing again. A simple curve, a hard transition followed by an opposing curve to give us the bottom of the deltoid. And you can see the difference between that technique and the first drawing, where it's just a simple curve all the way through and it really has no character. So continuing with the deltoid, I'm going along the top and just connecting my curves again, making sure to curve, create a hard point, and then go into an opposing curve. And then I'm going down through the elbow, curving. I'm creating a small line of beauty below the elbow. It just describes so much more forms in a much more fluid way. Coming to the inside of the arm, simple opposing curves. I've got a hard transition, but it's relatively soft. And now just continuing in those same shapes. For this smaller shape here, I've actually come out and created a bit of a harder point. It's something I can get away with for smaller details on a figure, and it can give it a lot of character. But you want to avoid that for some of your larger forms. It can get a little bit distracting. Now I'm going down through the muscles on my forearm. I get asked a lot about how to draw forearms. And the truth is that my knowledge of all those little muscles that make up your forearm and your finger extensors is relatively limited. I have a basic sense of where they all go, but what really makes it work is just using this simple shape language consistently across the form. In order to make it work, though, you need to bear in mind that you're essentially drawing football shapes that connect for your muscles. And this is something that I've shown before, but just to drive the point home, here are some simple shapes that are all connected together, and so your muscles actually connect and form a bit of a network. If you don't have those connections working, your muscles will look like they're just floating in space and will start to just look like lines on paper. Now for his chest, I'm going to go a little bit concave and then come around complex. Let me just accentuate that just a little bit more, just like that. It isn't really necessary to hit every single form with an opposing curve, but I think when you're learning this, it's probably a good idea to really think in those terms. It is possible to push a concept to the point where it actually starts to become distracting and can start to take away from the final drawing. So you do have to be a little bit careful. I'm going to go ahead and draw the edge of his rib cage. You can see in my first curved example that the rib cage really doesn't have a natural flow at all, and it looks a little bit artificial. And then the second example, it's a little bit better at describing the form, but it's very rigid. And
let me catch up with that arm that he's drawing.
Serratus, and then moving down into the oblique, and it's a curve followed by an opposing curve, and then coming up to the side of the stomach. Now getting the other side of the oblique in, using the exact same technique, connecting it in to make sure that my muscles all work together. Now just drawing in the edge of his buttock, drawing a curve followed by an opposing curve, this time with a hard transition. Sometimes I'll use a hard transition if I want it to be just a little bit more rigid, and sometimes I'll go softer if I want a softer form. I really feel like I'm saying the same thing over and over again, and I am, but I strongly recommend that you draw this along with me, and you'll very, very quickly get a sense of just how much of this you can internalize very, very quickly. It becomes automatic before you know it, and it will will just become part of your drawing vocabulary, and I think it will make your drawing much, much stronger. Now, at this point, we're going to go into another aspect of shape language, and that is in our shadowing. This is a place where we actually will start to cross over into something more akin to what you would imagine shape language to be in painting. And this is an example of a figure drawing by Jeffrey Watts, and the shadows in this are incredibly believable, but also really artfully produced. They have a beautiful confidence and flow. And in order to achieve that, he's using the same techniques that we'll be using here for our shadows, and hopefully you can see how much they naturally build on the shapes that we've already established in our simple line drawing. Before we get there, though, I want to go ahead and just start to establish some line weight. So I'm lighting this
you're done with it already, man. Yo, man, come on, man.
Here from the top left, which is really my standard lighting for most of these examples. And
yeah, just wanted to see the face and how he placed it. I really like this line he put on the traps over here, like this. I didn't do mine like he did his. All right, let's follow.
I have a video that goes into depth on how to use line weights. I'll add a link to the video in the upper left or right corner right here, so you can go check that video out. I really recommend, if you haven't seen it, to take a look at that so you can get a sense of what we're doing here. But this is a great intermediary step between your simple flat line drawing and starting to put in shadows. Really, for a lot of artists, this is as far as you need to take your work. And just to quickly recap what we're doing with line weights, so you don't have to go watch a whole other video. If you want to just stick with this one right now, I'm going to go ahead and draw a sphere and light it the same way, so it's dark on the opposing side away from the light. And so I've gotten thicker with the line. I've drawn another sphere behind it. I've gotten thicker with that line too. And I make sure also to go thicker where I have connection points. And that really helps solidify forms in space. And just a little bit more, and it's almost a form of lighting. It really is a form of lighting, but it's a great way to help ease your way into the more heavy lighting that we'll do in just a minute. All right, so now that we have that established, it's time to go into our shadows. We have our lighting established.
Help me out here. Give me a minute, yeah? Let me just catch up the shadows.
We have our line weights drawn in, and we have our basic forms drawn in a much more natural, flowing way. And so ideally, we want our shadows to continue that theme. I've gone ahead and drawn a slight curve from under his chin and then an opposing curve over his neck and in his eye. I'm making sure to delineate my shadow very, very clearly. I want to make sure that I'm not scribbling things in and things are very clearly defined, and I'm creating appealing shapes all the way through. Under his mouth, I've got a shadow.
Yeah, he's very intentional about the way he applies the shadows to his characters. And this shadow like application, it takes a while to learn. Like me, for instance, whenever I'm applying shadows on my characters, like in my comics, I usually have to use references a lot of the time. And because I haven't taken my time to actually properly practice shadowing, it's a bit of an issue.
And the direction of that curve and the opposing curve is something that you can really play with if you want. And I'm going to go ahead and do it the opposite way. So I'm curving inward and then curving outward for the bottom part. And I think it works just as well. There are times that one curve will work better than another. You really want to think about your underlying form. But for the most part, it's just using a curve and an outside curve to get that effect. So now for his deltoid, I'm drawing in a nice line of beauty curve and then filling that in. I'm going to draw the central head of his deltoid, doing the exact same thing. A nice line of beauty. I'm not drawing a simple curve. I'm not drawing something that's just hard-edged, but it gives me something that is a nice medium between those with a lot of flow. I'm going to draw in a bit of a striation beside that muscle, and I'm going to use the same thing, a bit of a curve, a hard point, and then an opposing curve. And you can see how that gives me a bit of a believable looking smaller muscle in there, and it looks very, very natural. And now the same thing for the back of the deltoid, a curve, a bit of a hard point, an opposing curve, and that completes out the shadowing on the back of the deltoid. It really is the same kind of technique that I was using for my lines. I'm just using that technique to describe shapes that I can then fill in with shadow. Now for his chest, on the other side of his body, I want to go a little bit more shadowed, and so I'm going to go ahead and define a shadow shape. And you can see the same kind of line of beauty, the same thing that we've done all the way through this. It is so incredibly simple and so effective every single time. And so there it is. I'm going to draw in some striations the same way that I did on the deltoid. Really is just a line of beauty, but just a little bit more hardened, just with a hard transition point as opposed to a soft curve. And that's something that really is up to you as the artist. If you want something that's just a little softer or something that's just a little bit more aggressive in your shape, I like something that's just a little bit harder. So I like those harder transitions, but it's a choice that you have to make for what's best really for what you're trying to achieve with your work. Now for a stomach, I'm going with a curve, an opposing curve, and then finishing it out with another opposing curve, and then just filling that in. The exact same thing for the other side of his stomach. Now I'm going to go ahead and cast a bit of a shadow from that top part onto the central part of his stomach, and then just draw the same kind of curve again. Now for this last bit, I want that to be fairly dark. We're turning away from the light. It's being heavily shadowed from the stomach above, and because that's heavily shadowed, I'm going to go ahead and shadow that oblique muscle in beside it. So much of my lighting, I really do work out in terms of connecting shapes like this. I don't think of lighting an entire picture all at once because it would be incredibly daunting. What I do is I take each individual piece and I shadow them one after the other. I try to bear in mind how far around, if it were a sphere, how far around that sphere it is away from the light, and shadow it accordingly. So if it's up toward the light, obviously I don't want shadow. The further away it gets to the light, the darker it's going to get, or the more wide the shadow is going to be across the form. So I want to quickly show, I've got a small shadow just along his stomach, and it's using a simple hardened line of beauty, and then I'm just filling it in from below with shadow, and you can see that I can just connect it, fill it in, and my natural shapes that I'm using for my line drawing really lend themselves well to creating nice looking shadow shapes. And you can see how much more effective that is than if I was to just draw something that is completely hard edged or soft. And so I'm going to just repeat that all the way through all of my serratus. The same basic shape. It's very, very natural and easy to do. I really recommend, again, that you draw this along with me. Give it a try, and it will become automatic before you know it. His lat's turning away from the light, and that whole form is really turning away from the light, so you can see I'm going wider with my shadow. I'm covering more of the form with the shadow as I go down through and rounding it up toward the light. So it makes it very, very simple to take your lighting and make it work over a larger form if you just think about it in those terms. Put a shadow onto my oblique. And then finish the shadow on my stomach using the same technique again. And now we're going to go ahead and move into the arm. I'm working on the deltoid and dropping my shadow in along the shadowed side of the deltoid. I'm describing a little bit of a vein in there. And so I'm leaving just a little notch open so I can start to put that in. And I'm just using the very same shape that I've got right there to describe my tricep muscles. And I've got a connecting muscle between the bicep and the tricep. And you can see if I went round with it or if I went hard with it, I can get that in there, but it really doesn't look believable. And so I'm just going to go ahead and just use the same very simple, slightly hardened line of beauty and quickly throw that in. And now for the extensors in my forearm, I'm going to use the exact same thing that I've been doing this whole time. I'm much more worried about creating nice looking shapes with my basic line of beauty than I am about exactly where every muscle goes and making sure that it's perfectly anatomically correct. You'll actually make a drawing that's much more believable looking with good shape language than you will with perfect anatomy. Now, for the tendons along the back of his hand, I see this very, very often, where they're just drawn as very simple straight lines, and it looks incredibly unrealistic. So just using a little bit of shape language makes those lines look so much more, and I see this you will with perfect anatomy. Now, for the tendons along the back of his hand, I see this very, very often, where they're just drawn as very simple straight lines, and it looks incredibly unrealistic. So just using a little bit of shape language makes those lines look so much more organic. They actually read as much more believable. It's the same basic form, but you can see how this takes it so much further. It makes it so much more believable. I'm going to go ahead and start to draw in some form for his face. Some of this I'm not really going to want to light, but what I want to do is just to start to sketch in some of the planes of my face and show you just how much using the same basic shapes that we've been using gives you such a nice flow along his cheek, along his jaw, and all around all of the planes of the face. And so that's it. I've said this a couple of times, but I highly, highly recommend that you try this one. I really don't think this is something that you can pick up just by looking at it. Give the kind of line of beauty that I like to use a try. Try a simple curved line of beauty, and then try a line of beauty that has a bit more of a hard transition in it. And then draw this figure, or draw your own figure, and really try to use it everywhere in your own work and the difference that it will make in the overall quality of what you do. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next video.
Alright, so he has done it, so let me just copy it and catch up. Look at that line. Oh, he even added the shadows for the ears. What am I missing? The back of the head. What other part of the face am I missing? Yo, play it again. Wanted to watch that. Esteva. Fixing up the hands.
Shape language makes a line.
Alright. We're almost an hour. Almost an hour. Been doing this almost an hour. All right, I think I'm good. I think I'm done. Yo, have a nice day, lovely. Thanks for joining, by the way. Thanks for joining. See you later. Okay, no problem. I'll let her know. Look how quickly he applies the shadows. I'm gonna get this good one day. One day, I'm gonna get this good. I'll see you. Have a lovely rest of the day. No pun intended.
Looks so much more organic. They actually read as much more believable. It's the same basic form, but you can see how this takes it so much further. It makes it so much more believable. I'm going to go ahead and start to draw in some form for his face. Some of this I'm not really going to want to light, but what I want to do is just to start to sketch in some of the planes of my face and show you just how much using the same basic shapes that we've been using gives you such a nice flow along his cheek, along his jaw, and all around all of the planes of the face. And so that's it. I've said this a couple of times, but I highly, highly recommend that you try this one. I really don't think this is something that you can pick up just by looking at it. Give the kind of line of beauty that I like to use a try. Try a simple curved line of beauty, and then try a line of beauty that has a bit more of a hard transition in it. And then draw this figure, or draw your own figure, and really try to use it everywhere in your own work and the difference that it will make in the overall quality of what you do. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next video.
All right, let me compare and contrast with his work. Mm, it's supposed to be around the clavicle. All right, so what else? I need to learn to get these shadows all on my own without necessarily depending on reference. I think that is one big point to my art at the moment. All right, I think we did all right. I think we did good. It's not perfect, but it's good. I like the way it is. Let's compare the shadows with this is the sketch. This is the ink. Not necessarily ink, but like the black and white. The black and white. I like the line weight, very good line weight. And then there's the shadows. Without the shadows, with the shadows. Yeah, I think it's all right. I think it's good. Um, this was a nice exercise. I think I'll do another video. I have another live stream coming up. So if you're still around, you can always check it out when I come live. I might even do that live immediately. It's actually scheduled for 9 p.m. But like it's another David Finch video. But I'll run it. I'll run it through. Remember, my goal is sort of like to get through all his videos and like learn, see what I can pick up. One thing he didn't add with a lot of these videos is the hatching lines. Usually he adds hatching lines to his work. So you usually see him like do stuff like this, put hatching lines here and there. But he has a video for that, and I think I've even done a video where I studied it and I sort of like explained it. So you can check that out because I think that's the next stage from this. So from line weight or line of beauty, the next stage is the shadowing. From the shadowing, you can then do the cross hatching, and that's the next phase. But anyways, I'll stop the video here. Thank you guys for joining me. I really appreciate everyone. Yeah, I'll see you guys in the next video.